All right. Ooh, it's cool. It says recording in progress now. Awesome. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first LingUA Gigs panel, Gigs standing for Getting into Grad School. My name is Olivier Jamlois. I'm joined today by Maxine Van Doren, Ben Lang, and Shai Nelson. They're all grad students here at UCSD in linguistics. I'm also joined by Bethany Macanienta, who's a fellow LingUA board member. So we're basically going to dive into the question of why should I go to grad school and how do I choose which one to go to? So we're going to begin with kind of a structured question and answer segment with some pre-prepared questions, and then we're going to open it up for the public to ask questions. So the first question that we have to ask is to the grad students is what made you decide to go to grad school for linguistics?
I'm happy to go first on that one. I'm a little bit of a unique case in this scenario because I actually come from a family of linguists in all senses. There's a little bit of a family background as to why I'm interested in linguistics, which is that there are many language instructors, and my sister is also a language instructor, and a lot of people. So I've been around language for a long time, and so I just generally have a personal interest in it that comes from being around it all the time. And in the sense of like people learning second languages and stuff like that, because naturally many of us are around language all the time using it anyways. And so the thing that made me want to actually go into grad school though is like I really do enjoy teaching and instruction. And so pairing the interests in linguistics and getting an undergrad degree in linguistics with the fact that I actually enjoy teaching and I enjoy instruction, and like I personally had a very positive like high school experience and college experience, and so the idea of being able to instruct, but then based on material that I really enjoy and I'm super passionate about, which is linguistics and cognitive science, is sort of the two main motivating factors for me to actually go to grad school. So my trajectory is kind of the typical I'm interested in academia and I'm interested in instruction, and so that's what made me want to go.
I can go next. I feel like in a different way, have a unique journey towards linguistics. When I was an undergrad, I was actually an astrophysics major and then an English major, and then I double majored in linguistics as my like fun major, the thing that I was like really interested in, but for some reason did not consider as something I could like go into for some reason. And it wasn't until my final quarter of undergrad that I was working on a research project in linguistics that I was like, oh, I want to keep doing this forever. And so I actually took a couple of years off and worked in a lab. I went to UC Davis. So I worked at the Center for Mind and Brain in the cognitive neurolinguistics lab there, and got some like firsthand experience on like doing more research and figuring out what I wanted to pursue as like a specific field. And so that's kind of how I got there, and now I am doing research on sign languages and neurolinguistics. And also, like Ben was saying, I really love to like teach, and I really love language and science. And so language and science together is linguistics, and is kind of why I love it so much. But also I love school, and so I loved the ability to just stay in school in grad school and be in academia and be around other people who also just like love learning stuff. So I think that that's one of the things that I would say is that if if you're trying to think about whether you want to go into grad school or not, I would say that like thinking about like if you actually enjoy being in a school like environment, and if you actually like being around like academia and stuff, that seems really obvious, but it's also like if that's not your thing, then grad school might not be your thing, and that's totally fine. But it's definitely something to consider, is what is your relationship with like a school environment. And for me, I love it, so that's why I wanted to keep going with it.
All right, I'll go last, I guess. So I did my undergrad in linguistics because I thought it was cool. I thought it was interesting. I wanted to major in theater, but my Parents wouldn't pay for school if I majored in theater. So I majored in linguistics and got a minor in theater. And I loved it. I thought I think language is cool and just really interesting. And then I got a master's in speech pathology and worked for 5 years and thought that I would never go back to grad school ever. But the more I was doing voice work and saw that we don't really know what we're analyzing when we analyze the voice, the more I realized I wanted to go back to grad school and research some of these questions that were just kind of nagging me in the clinic. And so that's what I do now. I do research on the voice and specifically voice disorders and how they compare to normal voice and their use of non-modal phonation.
Thank you so much. And so our next question is, with the fact that you all come kind of with similar interests, but also because of academia and your interest in that and teaching, how did you decide, based on your interest, what grad school fits you the best? What was like your thought process behind that in choosing schools?
I can go first if that's okay. So I was choosing between UCSD and UCLA, and I knew that both of the advisors that I had the option of working with were just excellent researchers, and I would get great advising wherever I went. So that wasn't really a factor. I just wanted to live in San Diego and I hated LA. And I think that's okay. When you're thinking about what school you're going to go to, you also should be thinking about where you want to live, because some cities might be hard for someone to live in. And so for me, living in San Diego was a major positive compared to living in LA, because the two programs were similar in terms of the level of advising that I would get. So that wasn't really a factor in my decision.
I can go next. I was also choosing between a couple different schools, and the main thing that I was focusing on when I was like making lists of potential schools and programs was really focusing on who my advisor would be and what my lab would be. Like I said before, I'm studying sign languages, and so I was like focusing on like what are the different labs that focus on sign languages, and particularly because I'm interested in late language acquisition, who is working on those kinds of things. So I think that potentially one piece of advice I would have is to think about people like researchers who you've read articles by that had things that you were interested in. Not necessarily that you have to be pursuing exactly what they are studying, but things that are related, ways that they could like help inform your research by what they are an expert in. So for me, I think I mostly focused on like PI or advisor and lab in that regard. But I would definitely second what Maxine said in terms of finding a place that you would actually enjoy living. I mean, I think that probably makes sense, but you're going to be in a grad program for probably longer than you were in an undergrad program. And sorry. And because grad school can be pretty demanding at times, so you want to be living somewhere that you feel like you're happy to live in, that is close to things that you enjoy doing. So like if you like going on hikes, or you like going to the beach, or you like doing indoor things, or like whatever it is that you like to do, like you don't want to only think about it as a school type of thing, but as like this is where you're going to live, and this is like a place where you're potentially going to be like settled for a while and like making like friends and community. So those are also important things to consider.
I'm probably going to say something very similar to what they said. So I'm just going to say the one thing that's like a little bit different, which is just so I don't totally repeat everything. But again, I prioritized selecting an advisor that I really knew was going to be someone that could support the type of research that I wanted to do. And so when I'm thinking about like how do I find the grad school that fits my interests or find the grad program that fits my interests, I kind of considered what my own interests were, which is that I do interdisciplinary work between linguistics and cognitive science. And I do ultimately in linguistics, like my first and main goal is to be a very solid phonetician. I mainly study speech perception and production. And so when I was looking at grad schools, I had lists of schools in the back of my head, like when I was applying to undergrad of, here's the set of UCs that I want to apply to, and then maybe here's some of the private schools that I'm interested in. What I would do is look at their department websites and find different departments that I thought might be able to support me. So I might look at a psychology department, a linguistics department, a cognitive science department, those sorts of things. But there's a structural element to that, which is if a place has a cognitive science department, it means that they probably are doing interdisciplinary research, whereas some institutions still only have a separate psychology department and a separate linguistics department. And so what I know is that if my interests are that I'm going to want to do interdisciplinary research, I need to make sure that I find a grad school that's going to be able to support that in the background, regardless of who my advisor is. And so to offer an example of that, UCSD is one of those places where I knew that I'd be able to access a bunch of different departments because there's explicitly like an interdisciplinary program in cognitive science that you can do as a PhD student so that you're in linguistics, but then also in a couple of different departments. But I did my undergrad at New York University in New York City, and they don't have a cognitive science department, but they have a linguistics department, they have a psychology department, and the two talk to each other. But the only way you're going to get a sense of that is then actually looking at their websites and looking at the faculty and maybe discussing with someone that's a graduate student or a faculty there about the attitudes that people have about doing interdisciplinary research. And so since that was a priority and that was one of my interests, it ended up being one of my main questions for, when I was actually researching and making a list of places. Does it look like a given department is kind of siloed into its own field, or does it look like there's a cross-disciplinary thing? And then in those departments themselves, who would be my advisor, and am I going to have a good relationship with that person? So.
I also want to add a couple more things if possible. I would say that for linguistics, especially, Twitter is a really good place to find out what's happening in linguistics with different advisors, with grad students. So if you find a program that you're interested in or an advisor that you're interested in, you might be able to find them on Twitter. You might be able to see who it is that they're interacting with to see that kind of interdisciplinary aspect, as well as like how are they using Twitter? Is there things about how they use Twitter, compatible with like what you want to be doing with your research or with like your science communication? So I think that that's one place to look. I also just wanted to recommend something that I did when I was looking at different grad schools, which is I had like a spreadsheet of different schools, and I had things like what are the specific things that I want out of a grad school, whether that's like academic or social or like living environment, and like had like a long list of potential grad schools that I could then narrow down based on like how many of those things different schools or programs or advisors hit, as well as like what are their requirements and like what are the different kinds of research projects you'll be able to do there, or like anything extra that they have. But I think we've already said, like kind of prioritizing what you want out of a grad program is a good way to kind of start narrowing down your list if you like have way too many possibilities.
Yeah, this conversation about interdisciplinary studies actually segues really well in my next question, which is how did you choose your graduate program? That is like linguistics as opposed to other closely related fields that you're interested in.
Oh, Ben, you can go ahead. I can go next.
Okay. I'll just go because it's sort of short because it's related to what I just said, which is that I wanted a place that was very interdisciplinary, right? So in addition to the phonetics that I do, I primarily do neurolinguistics. And so I do MEG, MRI, EEG, these sorts of things. So the grad school that I was picking had to have that accessible. If it felt like there was a grad school that I was like looking at the department and it seems like no one really did neurolinguistics research, and adjacent departments like psychology or cognitive science didn't have that, I didn't really consider it. And so, like Shai was saying, I had a spreadsheet, and so I had a column that was like, MEG, MRI accessible, and if a place had that checked off, then that means it was a place that I should consider. And then, I mean, that's all from, and like the program capacity as well, and the program aspect. As both Shai and Maxine have mentioned, there's also additional factors outside of the program itself that make you want to decide to actually choose a grad school. And I know that we might be talking about some of the funding packages and stuff like that in a second, but what I wanted to emphasize is that, like, for me personally, I'm from San Diego, and so my support network was already here. So when I had to choose between San Diego and the other choice that I had was Northwestern, and so it was either go to Chicago and start again, which I had done a couple different times at NYU, and then relatedly was studying abroad, or I could come back to San Diego and ensure that the 5 years of time-ish that I'm going to be spending in the program are very, very stable, while I'm going through grad school, which is both fun and difficult at the same time, right? And so one of the main factors was like, what is my support network going to be, and is that support network a place where I can easily, do all the things I like to do, like if you like to run around and go outside and go to the beach and go hiking and do anything like that, which is not necessarily me, but my family was here, and so I can on the weekend go to the movies with my sister, and so I conveniently had that happen like within my two choices, that I could choose between support network and family, and being able to interact with them and having stuff outside of the grad program to enrich the entire experience. That's different from what potentially would have been my experience in Chicago, where I would have been like super cranky and cold right now, to be honest. So it was both a decision of like, what are the interdisciplinary things and what are the academics that can be offered to me, and then also what is my life going to look like in that city, and what is my life going to look like outside of that program.
Yeah, so the weather was a huge factor for me. I lived in Boston for 7 years, and I had 7 winters and decided that I didn't want to have any more winters. And so when I was applying to grad school, I knew that I wanted to be back in California. That's where I'm from. My family's here. So for sort of similar reasons, like grad school is really hard, and it's nice to have the support of your family or whoever you're close to that is your support network. It might not be, the family that you grew up with. It could be your chosen family, but it's really nice to have that support and have that network outside of the program. So being in California was important, and specifically I was choosing between speech language pathology, so doing a PhD in speech pathology, since I already had my master's in speech pathology, or doing a PhD in linguistics. And there just weren't any voice specialized speech pathologists that were doing strong cross-linguistic research. And I was really specifically interested in the interaction between language and voice use. And that's just not a question that's asked in speech pathology, because it's rehab focused and it's disordered focused. And there are people who do work in normal voice use, right? That's part of their research, but it tends not to be the focus of a PhD program. And I knew the program would also entail a lot more rehab theory, and I wasn't particularly interested in rehab theory. I'm more interested in phonetics, and I'm kind of more of a speech scientist that like dressed up as a linguist, and so I wanted to put on more of a linguist coat and less of a rehab focused coat.
Yeah, what's funny is I've done the opposite of Ben and Maxine, which is that I went to my undergrad 45 minutes away from my family, and then I went to grad school 9 hours away from my family. So if anybody wants to talk about that kind of moving very far away, I moved to San Diego for grad school and knew nobody, and was long distance with my partner and from my family and everything, which was added some difficulty. So I definitely appreciate the idea of, staying with near people that can be a support system, whether that's friends or family or whoever, but you can survive if you're not near your support system. You can make a support system, or you can do what I did, which is just get my partner to move to San Diego and make make my support system be here, and also adopt cats, which are also a great support system and is also what I did. As far as like choosing a specific like field, like linguistics versus psychology or cognitive science, I kind of just have to agree with Ben and Maxine in that I really wanted to be really strong as a linguist. I really wanted to focus on linguistics in my research in terms of the questions that I was excited by or interested by were linguistics focused. And so I'm also doing the interdisciplinary program in cognitive science. And so basically the way I thought about it was that cognitive science is going to inform my linguistics, but the opposite can also be totally true. If you really want to go into a different non-linguistics field and have linguistics like inform what you're doing there, then that's also totally valid. So I think kind of just thinking about like, what are questions that you're interested in, and like what is the framework that will help you answer those questions, especially in regards to like having an advisor who is an expert in something. Like having a linguistics advisor is going to be really useful if you're answering really linguistic questions versus having a cognitive science advisor who is going to be able to give you, a different array of knowledge and experiences. Obviously, if you're doing interdisciplinary work, then you're hopefully going to have some of both, like we can do here at UCSD, but I definitely would try to think about what kinds of questions and what field is able to answer those, kind of like what Maxine was saying.
Those are really like great tips to think about, not just like the academic side of it, but just the living, like how do you want your social life outside of school to be? And is that an important factor? Another thing that I think is really important is how did funding factor into your decision of which graduate school to attend? I think that's something that everyone has to think about, so.
I can go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my master's first, because I know that there are some people who are interested in a master's, and I'll talk about my PhD. So for the master's program, I applied. I don't know why I did this, but I applied to all private schools. I wouldn't recommend this. And it's expensive. So master's in speech pathology is expensive everywhere, and private schools are extremely expensive. And so I ended up getting just the best scholarship at Boston University. And that was one of the main reasons I went there is they gave me more money, so I didn't have to take out as many loans. For the PhD, often you're funded for a lot of programs. There are some programs that will accept you and not necessarily offer a funding package. So that's something to keep an eye out for, and it should be very clear if you're getting funding. If there's a possibility of funding, that is not guaranteed funding. So for both the schools that I got into, there was guaranteed funding through TA-ships. So we TA to pay for ourselves, like our tuition, and we're also paid. And so we get some money from that, and that's like enough to pay rent and pay your bills and buy food for just yourself. It's if you have a family, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to live off of grad school stipends. And then on top of that, you can get grants, or fellowships. So I have an additional fellowship from the Jacobs School of Social Science, Social Science Jacob Fellowship, I think that's what it's called, which is this person who endows a fellowship. And I think there are a couple of grad students in social sciences division that get it every year. And that gives us an extra like $12,000 a year on top of our TA-ships. So I got that from UCSD, and I knew that before I was choosing between UCSD and UCLA. I got a different fellowship from UCLA that would have allowed me to take off of TAing for 2 years, which equals about $50,000. So they tell you it's a $50,000 fellowship, but they're not actually giving you that money. It just means you don't have to work. So it's kind of it's buying you out of TAing essentially, and then you just get your normal stipend. And it made more sense to me to just TA and take the extra money because I like to have a nice quality of life, and I'm used to I was working before, and so it's nice to be able to do things like go out to eat and like hang out with my friends who are in their 30s who like to do things that are kind of expensive. And it's, it's just real life. So those are a couple of options. There are also, lots of grants. We can talk about that more after everyone else sort of shares how funding factored into their decision. But grants and fellowships, some people are funded by their advisor, and that's an option too if your advisor has grants. So mine doesn't have a grants that will fund all of his students, but we have worked as research assistants for him, and so we'll get funded like through the summer for that.
Jinx. Do you want? Okay. All right. Okay. So funding was a factor for me in the sense that I basically needed to decide between a larger stipend and less of a support network, or a smaller stipend and more of a support network. And so part of my whole thing about like me coming back to San Diego is like, I'll be fairly honest, like my family is here, my parents are here. It makes it a little easier when I can like, meals sometimes get covered during the week because I'll go and hang out with them, or, I'll go and hang out with my sister and we order something and we're sharing those sorts of costs. Or, I don't necessarily need to travel for the holidays now, except the 20 minutes I need to drive north, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of different things that like would have added up that sort of make it the same. Because there was about a $10,000 to $12,000 difference between the stipend that UCSD offered me and the stipend that Northwestern offered me, which is a significant amount. And so that amount, that calculation was that I knew that I personally had a support network here in the background that would be able to offset some of those costs. As Maxine said, the stipend it's not a super like amazing stipend, at least that we have at the moment. It pretty much just covers rent and some living costs. And so you always kind of just want it to be a little bit more. So just be aware that the amount that generally is offered at most graduate programs is going to feel roughly in that same range. Another thing about my background in this scenario, though, is that I also worked for about 4 years before I went into grad school. And so I built up a little bit more of my own personal wealth for me to be able to support myself while I'm in grad school. And so I worked as a research assistant for a couple of years in Abu Dhabi, and then prior to that, I worked completely outside of academia. I worked in international development for a consulting company and also for a travel agency. It was all sort of over the map, but those 4 years of work experience allowed me to go ahead and actually build up, enough savings and enough other things in the background that I can also personally supplement my own financial situation during grad school. And so that isn't necessarily going to be the case for everybody, but I like to be transparent about that because I tend to speak in a relatively positive tone about the financial experience of a graduate student, and that is not necessarily the standard, despite what many universities want you to think. The standard is that people actually struggle a little bit more. And so that was like kind of what my funding situation in the background was. I don't necessarily qualify for any of the like additional scholarships as well, or anything else that's usually offered for UCSD or UCLA. And so it was kind of a just like, here's the funding packages, make a rote comparison between the two. Which one am I going to be able to support myself easily on? And which one's going to be like very easily factored into what my support network is in San Diego versus what my support network would have been in Chicago, for example.
Yeah, I think like for most people, funding was definitely really important to me in going to grad school, but I do have to say that I come from a background where the amount of money that I make as a grad student is more money than I would have had ever made before, and more money than like one of my parents makes in a year. And so it's an interesting situation to be in where I understand that I'm not making enough money for the work that I do, but also that like I do okay on it, and it's like the most money I've ever had. So I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I think that for me, I go back a second. So when you get an offer from a school, they should, I don't know if any school wouldn't do this, but they should be telling you upfront how much funding they are giving you, whether, like Maxine said, whether TA-ships are going to be guaranteed or whether they're just like available. So I would definitely recommend confirming any of that if it's for some reason unclear. UCSD's linguistics department is really great because we have guaranteed TA-ships, and we don't have guaranteed funding for the first couple of summers. So that's something to also think about is there funding over the summer? Unfortunately, a lot of academic pay is for like 9 months, not for 12 months. And so you want to also keep that in mind. You may be thinking that you're getting paid a decent amount of money, but that you're not getting it for the whole year, and you might need to figure out where you're going to get money over the summer. One other thing to think about with that is actually asking grad students or faculty in the department that you're interested in, do people ever not get funding during a quarter or during a summer or during a semester, whatever it is? Because that can give you a lot of information. If they're like, oh yeah, sometimes people don't get funding, that might be a red flag to you of like, oh, why do people not get funding and what do they do in those situations? So like finding out, okay, do people help the students figure out where are they going to get grant money, or who are they going to work as a graduate student researcher with? If you're interested in a particular advisor, you can also ask them, like, do you have an abundance of funding in your lab or in your work? I'm really fortunate that the Mayberry lab has a good amount of funding. So during the summer, I can get funded as a research assistant. That might not be possible, but there may be other labs in that department that accept other students to do work for them to get funding. So it's really good to ask grad students in whatever program you're interested in, where do they get their funding from in that program, and do they ever not get funding? And that might tell you that maybe this isn't where I want to be if I have to be in a precarious financial situation. Yeah, I think that's all I have to add.
I want to add something else, if that's cool. Okay, cool. So as Shai just mentioned, there's like at UCSD, the way that the funding structure is set up is that like we have the option, or we're guaranteed the TA-ship, but the funding is like only 10 months, and then or 9 to 10 months, and then we kind of need to fill in the rest. That's not necessarily how it's going to be at every university, and so whether like the university should tell you how much money you're going to get and what you're funded for, but the way that shakes out is going to be completely different from one university to the next. And so I can tell you that like the way that it works at like a place like Northwestern is that you're fully funded for 12 months and you're required to TA. So it's not necessarily that like you might have the option of TA one time or then fellowship. You're a TA the whole time. And then at a place like NYU, you're guaranteed funding for 12 months. And then TA is optional, but they pay you additional money if you TA. So depending on like what your combination is, you want to ensure that you actually understand what that combination is from the university that you've applied to, and once they've offered you a funding package, get literally all of the details, because like it's a sweet deal if you're basically guaranteed 12 months of funding and you don't have to TA. That's great, because then it's just a living stipend, right? And so you want to get all of the details, because even though you might be guaranteed 12 months of funding, there might be a number of caveats behind that. Or maybe you're only guaranteed a certain amount of funding, and there's a couple of options a way that could get fulfilled. So it might shake out to the same lump sum from one university to the next, but how you actually get that is going to vary a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm seeing that there's a question in the chat right now. We're going to go ahead and get to that once we're done with the structured questions. This is the last of the more structured questions. It's, what steps do you advise undergraduate students take if they're interested in grad school? Like, what can we do right now as undergrads?
I can start. I'd say one thing that you can do really easily is just be thinking a lot about it in terms of actually thinking through what are the things that I am interested in, because people might not appreciate this advice, but my general advice to people wanting to go to grad school is to take some time off before you go to grad school. I think that it is exceptionally important to like get out of school for a little bit, experience the world. Obviously, this is dependent on circumstances, on finances, and all of that. So like this is, you know, maybe in an ideal world, but being able to get into a lab as a, you know, paid research assistant for a couple of years, going into industry, seeing if that's something that interests you versus going to grad school later. For me, I took about 2 years between undergrad and grad school. During that time, I worked like minimum wage jobs and also worked as an unpaid research assistant in a lab. But all of that was really helpful for me because if I had applied right out of undergrad, I would have been studying probably something very different and probably would have eventually found what I am now studying that is really interesting to me and that I'm really passionate about. So I think that especially coming out of like a general linguistics degree, there's probably lots of things that interest you, and taking some time to actually like read more papers on topics that you're interested in, like get in contact with people in programs and maybe stay in contact with them for a little while and get to know them is really good because yeah, I don't know. I think that if I had gone to grad school right out of my undergrad, it would have been a very different situation and probably not as positive of one. I felt much more like an adult going into grad school and like starting a career as opposed to like going into more school. I think that also applies because even though I knew that I loved school, I was like, I should probably take a little bit of time off to make sure that I don't like love real life even more than school or something. Like grad school is really difficult. It can take up a lot of your life while you're in it. And it's also like something that leads to whatever you're doing afterwards. And so you don't want to go into it too lightly. Even if you get into like a bunch of grad schools and they're all amazing and they give you like $1 million and it's like seems like it's going to be great, if you don't know what you are passionate about or what specific like more niche field you want to look into, you can spend multiple years at the beginning of your grad school experience like not knowing what you want to be doing and maybe having to go between different advisors and like spending time during that time trying to figure out what you want to do. Maybe that's what you want to do, then that's totally fine. But I definitely suggest just really thinking about it and really not just doing it because you really want to, but really you know, like talking to other people in grad school, doing things like these kinds of panels. I am not really on Reddit anymore, but before I got into grad school, I was on Reddit a lot on like all of the like grad school Reddits and like linguistics Reddits and all that kind of stuff. That actually provided like a lot of really good insight into people's experiences. You might have to like search through those a little bit and get some of the riffraff out, but it just was really good to be able to kind of like sit with myself as a human being and figure out like what do I really want to be doing next. Sorry, I wrote down my notes of like what you should be doing right now, so I'm just going to reference them. Yeah, like don't rush into it. Take time off, really think about it. You know, you probably have heard about like emailing different advisors and PIs and people that you might want to be working with. If you're going to take time off, you can potentially email them to like find out about their work without having to be like, I want to work with you, and try to, you know, develop relationships with people or grad students and working with them as a research assistant, reading things, watching videos, like getting really into the research. And just seeing what interests you. I can't read what I wrote. Oh, I wrote, this might not make sense to everybody. Do you want to be a grad student or do you have like a purpose for why you want to be in grad school? Do you really want to be a professor and a researcher? Is this a necessary step for going forward with that career plan? Or is it just that you, and this is going to probably trigger people, do you want to just stay in school forever so that you don't have to be a real adult? Or like, you know, obviously you can go to grad school and still go into industry and other fields and things like that. But those are good things to at least have thought about before you jump into grad school. Okay, I'm done now.
Those are excellent. I feel like you covered so much. I wrote down some very concrete things that I always recommend. So, if you want to do a PhD, you do need to get research experience, whether it's during your undergrad or, like Shai suggested, seeing if you can work in someone's lab after you graduate. But you don't know if you like research if you haven't done it. So get some research experience. The easiest thing would be, working as a research assistant while you're here as an undergrad. I would also highly, highly recommend doing an independent study project with a professor. So it's number two. If you don't know what kind of research you want to do, or if you don't have like a specific question in mind, if you can think of a study that you thought was really cool and replicate that study, that is a perfectly fine and excellent undergraduate research project. And you learn so much by replicating other people's work. So independent research project. Something I didn't do that I wish I had done is go to conferences. And especially now that they're virtual, just go to conferences, meet people at other institutions. I didn't do that at all when I was an undergrad, and I really regret it. I didn't even do it as a master's student, actually. And I really regret it because I think I just would have had a little bit more connections or maybe understanding of how the field works by meeting people and interacting with people in the field a little bit more and interacting with their research more. So go to conferences, present at conferences. You can present as an undergrad at conferences. And that kind of ties into the other two things that I have here is find a mentor. Your mentor should be a research mentor, so somebody who can help you with your research, and find a champion, which is somebody who is going to be in your corner, sort of cheering you along the way, whether they know anything about research or not. But you really do need those two people in your corner.
Totally. I agree with all of that because I've experienced all of that. I would definitely say that, yeah, finding someone that's going to be your champion and finding someone that's your mentor is very important. And the trajectory that put me in the position to have someone like that is me doing an undergraduate research project with that person at NYU. So my advisor slash mentor slash co-author slash friend, all of the above, champion, mentor, etc., is Lisa Davidson at NYU. And that's because I did my undergraduate thesis project with her, and then we turned the undergraduate thesis project into a publication, so I got research experience, and I also got experience bringing the poster to a conference, and I presented it to people, and then I had experience writing the paper, and so I basically had experience with the full gamut of things that you basically do as your job when you're a grad student in linguistics, right? And so if you can try and get any of those things done while you're an undergrad, you're going to set yourself up for having a really strong application to grad school, and then also set yourself up for having a good experience in grad school where you are able to actually handle some of the things because you have a little bit of experience in already doing them. Like I said, I was a research assistant in a language lab as well, just like Shai was talking about. In that lab, I was able to, I was putting subjects in machines, I was speaking with people. It was the bedside table version of what you're doing when you're a researcher, in addition to analyzing the data myself. And following through with all of those things, getting research experience. And it's more the standard today, I would say, at this point, that people kind of in the background expect a little bit of research experience on a grad student's application. And it also helps you offset things like maybe not some sort of stellar GRE score. Granted, those are going away, but you want to give yourself as many different things as you possibly can on your application. I do want to add a little minor caveat to that, which is people still do get admitted and go directly into grad school from bachelor's programs without a ton of research experience, so it's entirely possible. I don't want to discourage anyone that maybe isn't necessarily going to have access to a research assistantship or any of the things that we just said. You're still likely to get into grad school. But all of these other things that we're talking about are things that are going to both set up your application for being a stellar application and also give you the experience that's necessary to then actually complete the program. And I really want to emphasize that last thing, which is have a plan. So if you're going in, just like Shai was talking about, you want to go in with, are you just going as a grad student, or are you going in with, this is a plan as a step that I need to go into the next thing that I want to do. Here's the things that I'm interested in. This is the type of research that's related. having all of that and having an idea about that, about what your plan is going to be, and then also conveying that plan are very, very good things for both you and your potential mentor or advisor in the program. And it's going to help you sort of get into grad school and then also get into doing research and completing the program. Um, Another thing that I really want to emphasize, even if you're not someone that's doing like fully computational work, I do think it's important for you to do some sort of coding experience. You should definitely get experience using R, Python, MATLAB, any of the coding languages that people might use in order to do some sort of analysis. That is just going to make your life much, 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 much easier, even if it's dealing with the very simplest of projects, just a little bit of descriptive statistics, something like that. You don't necessarily need to be inventing the next machine learning algorithm. It's just so that you can deal with your own data and complete research, because so much of it these days relies upon you being able to manipulate and process your data, even in experiments as sort of I don't necessarily want to say simple, because speech perception and production is not simple, but in ones that don't necessarily use highly dimensional methods like speech production and perception versus something that's highly dimensional like MRI or MEG, you're going to need it for any number of those experiments, right? And it's just really important to develop that skill. And I see Shai recommended Statistics for Linguists. Excellent book. You should totally just read through, and it's written like a tutorial. The author does a great job at explaining things very simply. I highly recommend. So yeah, I just want to emphasize that building the skills is just important as making a plan of some sort in order to get into grad school.
Yeah, just to clarify for people who are watching later at a different time that may not be seeing the chat, Statistics for Linguists, an Introduction Using R is, like Ben said, a really great book. It's really easy to work through. I have worked through it, even though I've taken other statistics and R courses. After those courses, I worked through this book and learned a lot and thought it was great. It's free on the UCSD VPN, and you can download it to your computer. So just download it, even if you're not going to look at it right now. And you can look at it at some point in the future, but it's a great book. Oh, sorry. I also wanted to add that I would just like to be an example of somebody who never published anything or presented at a conference or created a poster or anything before getting into grad school. While I did have research experience in a lab, it was mostly the Ben was saying, the bedside table manner kind of stuff of I was working with kids in experiments, and I was working on analyzing the data and coding things and things like that. But I wasn't there long enough to actually publish anything or to write anything. And I still got into grad school. That's not to say that you can get into grad school super easily without any of that stuff. As Ben said, it's always good to diversify your CV of different things, of different experiences, with whether that's good scores on tests plus research and plus any papers that you wrote as an undergrad. Even if it was just for a class, you can use those as things that you can talk about in your applications, or use those as writing samples if you feel if they ask for that and you feel comfortable with it. But just want to say that people do get into grad school without tons of stuff on their CV. It definitely helps, but it's not impossible to do.
Cool. Thank you so much. So we're going to open it up for anyone to unmute or type in the chat what their questions are. We have a question from Warren, and when you ask your question, say whether it's for the whole panel or for one panelist in particular. I see we have a question in chat right now. I'm going to read it out for those that can't see the chat. Asking Ben, can I ask you more about your non-academic job and how you got into it? Warren is also thinking about leaving academia for some time before grad school.
Sure. So I sort of had I did a little bit of background about me is that I have a combined bachelor's and master's. So I did 5 years all at once at NYU. I did a bachelor's in language and mind, and then I did a 1-year master's in French studies. And so I basically had an extra year of undergrad, you could say, and then I ended up with a master's out of it. And I knew that I was sensing some sort of a little bit of burnout. And I knew that I really enjoyed linguistics and I would probably want to go to grad school at that point, and meaning going into a PhD program because I'd already completed a year of grad school as a master's student. But I knew that I wanted to continue at some point, but I knew that I needed a break. And so I happened to have an internship at a travel agency for a little while I was in undergrad. It was basically a paid internship where I came in and stuffed envelopes, and, something to get a little extra cash in on the side. And I was able to turn that into more or less a little bit of a full-time job right after I graduated from my master's program. So I was able to show up, and they had already known me, and they had seen me, and they knew that they could hire me on for a little while. And then I transitioned into a job at a company called Palladium. They do international development work for public health projects and other things around the world. This is sort of related to the French studies thing. I feel like I have two personal interests, linguistics and cognitive science, and then I'm really interested in history, sociology, development, decolonization, these sorts of things. And so that's why I wanted to work a little bit in international development. I kind of needed to choose which thing was my career path. Regardless, the idea was get a little bit of industry experience and apply with the experience I had from being an undergrad and finding a job where I knew that I could get training, even though I didn't necessarily have a skill set that I had developed in undergrad. And so then I worked at that international development company for about a year or so. And then that was running on the 2 years outside of academia mark, and I was having a good time. And then I saw a research assistant job open up at the Neuroscience of Language Lab at NYU Abu Dhabi, which I had connections to because I was a student at NYU, and so I applied to that and I ended up getting that. And so I went and I worked as a research assistant for 2 years at NYU Abu Dhabi. And so that was kind of back in academia, but I generally don't consider it to be back in academia because it was a full-time job. It was more the bedside manner stuff, putting people in machines, etc. So it was about a 4-year period outside of academia in the sense that I was working a full-time job. I highly recommend it. As Shai was talking about, it's vitally important to take a little bit of time off to reconsider, to get an idea of what you want to do. And as Maxine was talking about, it was really helpful to sort of build ahead of her experience in grad school as well. And so the way that I got into it is that I just applied to jobs. And that's kind of the goal, is to get that experience of a little bit of time outside of academia before I would then go back into doing a graduate program. And then the benefit from that is that, I don't know, the nice thing about a 9-to-5 job is that it stays at its 9-to-5 job after 5 p.m. So then you can kind of get a lot of experience of I want to do this thing this evening, and you don't have any projects following you, and you don't have to worry about any school things or any grades or anything like that, and you kind of just go to your job, leave at the end of the day, and meet your friend for happy hour or something. So it was nice to do that for a couple of years to get an idea of what that rhythm and flow are like. And I do think ultimately it was very important for then what my relationship is to my job as a graduate student, because I now value the fact that I need that time outside of grad school, and that I need that time separated from what my experience is as a student to then also go and meet a friend for happy hour or something like that. So I definitely think it's a super positive experience. You can do it for whatever amount of time you feel is necessary for you and whatever you're able to do. And I would just say find jobs that you feel like are going to build skills towards what you might need in graduate school, or towards a career that you could be interested in. Because I know plenty of friends who had many intentions of going to graduate school and then were hired in a job, and then they've just stuck in that career intentionally because they enjoy it. I have tons of details that I can say about all of that. So if whoever would like additional details, I can talk at length about my experience, not in academia, but definitely think that it's worth it to consider that if you're feeling like you want to do it.
I wanted to, if there's no questions, if there are questions, then I can stop. But I had two things that I'd written down that I really just wanted to mention to anyone interested in grad school. One of them being that I would not worry about the prestige of a university or a program when you're considering going to grad school. Maybe it affects things at some points, but in my experience and in other people that I know's experience, it's, as we've already said, it's so much better to go somewhere that you're going to be happy and that you're going to be like mentally healthy, and that you're going to be doing something that you're passionate about, that you're interested in. I think that most people who pick a program because of prestige or because an advisor is like really well known or whatever, tend to have a really bad time and tend to want to leave grad school, want to change what they're doing and stuff like that. So I would not worry about that. It's probably different from how you thought about undergrad, where maybe you're like, oh, I need to go to like, you know, a really good undergrad because the program's going to be the same between these two schools or something like that. But in grad school, I would not focus on that. And the last thing that I will say is that if you can, ask students at whatever school you are interested in if TAs or graduate student researchers have a union, and ask them about their union. And just, yeah, unions are great. And if you're going to a school that doesn't have a union, they will probably tell you what it's like to not have a union. We have a union here for two TAs, and we are working on, there's progress towards one for graduate student researchers, and unions are great for protections and for grievances and making sure that you actually get paid on time and that you get paid somewhat of enough money. But yeah.
Thanks, Shai. We have a few more minutes for anyone that wants to ask a question.
None of the other participants have questions. I actually had a questions for you guys. So I am a specialization in the speech and language sciences major. And so I know the SLP master's process a little bit, like you have to fill out a couple application forms, you take the GRE, although some programs now are not including that, 3 letters of recommendation usually, and then sometimes for SLPs you have shadowing, and then there's an interview. And so I was curious, if someone wanted to do linguistics, like master's applications, how different is that process from like other graduate school applications?
So I didn't do a linguistics master's except as what was part of the PhD program. So it's similar in that, I mean, you often, for a number of schools, they do require a GRE. Some of them don't. It's like UCLA doesn't require a GRE. They don't even want you to send their scores there. Like, don't even send them to UCLA. They'll just ignore them. You'll often need letters of recommendation, so usually about 3. The thing that differs for a PhD program is that they're going to want to see a writing sample. So they want to see a sample of how you think and how you write, and sort of what your potential is as a researcher, and to learn to be an independent researcher.
I wanted to note that there's some programs as well that, like, depending on the way it is constructed, as like whether or not it's just a single department or multiple departments involved, depending on which department you apply through, the application will change. So I think for like the joint program in like speech and hearing sciences that we have with SDSU and UCSD, I think the application is different depending on whether or not you're applying through UCSD or through SDSU. Because I think
they all go through SDSU.
Do they all? Okay, all right. Yeah. Because I know also that then like something like UCSD, you can apply to multiple departments at once. So you can apply to psych, linguistics, and cog sci with a separate application if you want. And then that can like help you sort of figure out, or at least kind of spread your application amongst the possible departments. which is convenient. If you have a similar application, you can basically send a relatively similar application to the 3 different departments. The last thing that I wanted to say about that as well is that this might be a singular situation in a very unique program, and Maxine might know about it as well, but the SHBT program at Harvard and like Boston University, speech, hearing, and bioscience and technology, right? Yeah. I don't know if Maxine wants to say something, but I know that like you can apply to that through different universities and then you would be placed in that program. And they had a sort of situation where like if you did a few extra classes, they would give you an SLP certificate. And so you could like get your degree in linguistics, but then also become an SLP. So if you kind of like try and dig a little bit, you might be able to get what you're looking for with one application, as opposed and like one type of application in linguistics. But I don't know. That's sort of just related stuff. But the more specific thing to answer your question, Maxine already answered, which is that the writing sample is the biggest difference.
Yeah. The other thing that I forgot that was a big surprise to me as I was turning in the applications, or once you get to the end, is that you have all these other statements to write. So you know up front that you have to write a personal statement, and some people want a personal history, or like, so you have a research statement, a personal statement, and then something that's a little bit different called personal history. And then I got to the end of the, like, for example, the UCLA application, and they also wanted a diversity statement that I didn't know up front. And they also wanted, trying to remember, there were other questions that you could answer. So there were like 5 or 6 of them, and you don't know until you're on that page of the application that you have all these other things to write. So it's a lot more writing heavy for the PhD applications. And then one quick thing about joint programs that might involve doing speech pathology. So if you're getting your PhD in something else and you think you want to also do your clinical work along the way, keep in mind that it's not just coursework, it's also clinical field work. And so it's a lot of extra time. It's doable and people do it. It is a lot of extra time though.
I want to add to that because you reminded me, because I also applied to UCLA. The last questions at the end, if I remember correctly, those are the ones that they use to evaluate whether or not they can give someone additional funding. So it's not necessarily something that like you're admitted and then you decide that like, oh, I can apply to these, and then your program mentors in the program are like, yeah, we can figure this out, and then you apply. It was all done up front. So in addition to the statement of purpose and the research statement and the diversity statement, you are also answering some of these questions, and based on what your response was in those, they could change more or less the type of funding that they could then give to you, which sort of like hidden curriculum thing on the back end. Oftentimes departments, the reason why they're asking for that up front is they might be able to admit an additional student because one of them qualifies for additional funding that they wouldn't normally have in a year. So say they're like, oh, they have funding for 4 students or something, but one of them is a stellar candidate for this one scholarship and can get it, they might be able to admit a 5th person because that person basically isn't paid for by the department. So that's to say, if there are statements that seem like they're additional to the statement of purpose, they are equally as important because it will potentially affect what type of funding package you're offered.
Thank you for all that information.
Yeah, okay. We are running into our 6 o'clock kind of stated end time. Sorry we went a little bit over, y'all, but thank you so much for being panelists for this. It's been amazing. Thank you everyone for attending as well. Yeah, thank you all so much. And
Thanks for
all right,
having
Bethany.
us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Bethany, I think we can end the recording.